Ever since starting Socially Constructed Online earlier this year, I have been well and truly on the circuit. I have attended physical events all across the nation. I've done so many virtual talks and webinars, and all of the myriad of different events that I've had, physical, hybrid, and virtual, have been so wildly different. But in a lot of ways, they've also so wildly failed. This video is actually one in an entire collaboration of a whole bunch of YouTubers who have some bones to pick with the way that we handle events. And this playlist is all about coming to ground on making our virtual, hybrid, and physical events so much better for the future. In order for me to break apart what I don't really like about the virtual, hybrid, and physical events that I've attended, I want to revisit a specific theory, rich media context theory. And then using that specific theory, I'd like to go through some of the events that I actually attended this year to talk about the things that I did not like. And I'd like to end this by reframing the purpose and goal of the online events that we actually build, and then looking at some people who are doing some incredible stuff in the space. Because let's be real, I am also kind of a culprit. I've run a lot of events that I didn't like, and in an effort to improve them, let's go over how to fix them. I want to start with some definitions that come from this book, Community, The Structure of Belonging by Peter Block. This was one of our latest book reviews. And in this book, he talks a lot about the fact that we need to switch the way that we work with our events to something more of an associative deliberative model. A deliberative conversation is a discussion explicitly built between a set of stakeholders to solve a tough problem by taking in information and then working through that information in a sort of groan zone, and then coming to a conclusion at the end of it all that most people, although not necessarily satisfied with, are perfectly happy implementing. Associative living is the concept of trying to build infrastructure, environments, and structures for that deliberative conversation that is born out of individual contributions from other people. The power isn't in the stakeholders, it's in the people who choose to attend the events. For example, let's consider a traditional stage. In a stage environment, you have a stage with curtains. It typically tends to be raised, and then you have a series of seats in order to include max viewability on the speaker. Very frequently, the stage is as well lit as it possibly can be, and individuals placed onto the stage tend to be gated in order to ensure that conversation tends to flow one way, from the stage over to the seats. In an associative deliberative format, you want to actually put the stage in the middle of the audience. For instance, a table or a circle that is surrounded by all of the audience members. It makes sure that the people who take the stage recognize they are part of a community, not at the head of that community, and it encourages increased deliberative conversation and small group conversation among community members. People feel more free to give their own opinions. They feel more free to put themselves out there. They feel like they are being heard, and they feel like there is value for doing so. A vast majority of small group environments, for instance, a breakout room in a Zoom, might comply with this notion and allow for that deliberative conversation. But is that really the best that we can do? I think not. And I think the reason is because we are confusing the purpose and the mission of our virtual events with what they're actually meant to do in online community. Let's explain why using rich media context theory. Rich media context theory holds that all media that we contribute has a specific goal, iteration, or purpose to the structure of its content. In many cases, like social media posts on Facebook or comments in Slack or Discord, they're ethereal. They are very low context. Anyone who moves into a platform is going to look at the event and see a sense of belonging. They're going to see all of the things happening, but they're not necessarily going to be able to jump in right away because they don't have the context to understand what's happening. If you were to have a conversation in a specific Slack or a Discord channel, that goes away fairly quickly. And in many cases, it's hard for you to jump in. But if you were to have a YouTube video that says, hey, we had this discussion in this Discord channel, here's where we think it's going to go, we're going to meet next Wednesday in order for us to continue this conversation, that is a high context artifact of a low context happening. This natural ebb and flow from a low context medium, such as a fast moving chat system, and a high context artifact, such as a YouTube video, a blog, or a newsletter that says, here's what happened this week, is really critical and important. On one end, low context information is a happening that creates belonging, and when missed, it produces a huge amount of FOMO, something that's incredibly useful in marketing. But at the same time, it leaves a lot of voices out of the room, and it makes sure that the people who are a part of that content are the stars of the show. As someone who's done a tremendous amount of webinars and podcasts and events where I do take the stage, I can definitely say that that's very useful for me as an influencer building my influence in the space, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a good thing for community. Using rich media context theory, let's now talk about what we can do to improve the space by first talking about a few of the mistakes that I think happened in the context of rich media context theory. My first example comes from CMX. I actually did a video about CMX, and one of the primary criticisms that was raised was the fact that physical attendees were effectively completely separated from the entire virtual conference. And the follow-through for physical events and people who actually wanted to watch the talks on CMX's YouTube channel, if the views is one indication, are not very high. In fact, I would be hard-pressed, especially given the view counts and the data on my own channel, to say that just uploading a talk that I were to give at any conference is actually useful to you watching it after the fact. They created a certain sense of FOMO by separating the people who were physically at the event from the people who were virtual. And a lot of the people who were there physically weren't able to see any of the virtual talks. We weren't even able to see the chat in the area. So not only did they produce FOMO for the people who weren't on the ground at their event, they also produced it for the people who were on the ground and really would have liked to interact with their virtual compartments. I think that the goals of the physical, the virtual, and the post-content events were all disparate. They were separate from one another. The goal of the physical conference, the physical event, was to cultivate a sense of feeling and belonging, which you certainly felt when you were on the ground, but you did not feel virtually. The goal of the virtual event setup, however, was to create content, just as they normally would in a virtual setup. And that content creation isn't really very good content after the fact, which makes no sense. There needs to be a lot more post-production, and in a lot of cases, people need to redo their talk with the intention of people actually seeing it after the fact. A really nice, compelling YouTube video is going to be 1 billion times more evocative and capacitive than a standard webinar recording. I also want to bring up the converse with Measure Summit. Measure Summit was the next event that I had specifically attended, and it's an all virtual event. But the problem with that all virtual event was that I didn't really feel any sense of belonging, capacity, or connection with the vast majority of the people that I was with at Measure Summit. Why? Where CMX was trying to produce belonging in physical events, Measure Summit was just trying to produce evocative, capable content for YouTube. And because of that, virtually all of the talks, because they were all pre-recorded, had intended to create evergreen content intended for people to consume it after the fact. This is a one-on-one interaction, consuming a vast majority of YouTube content, which did not necessarily make for the best event. Now, I'm not saying that CMX or Measure Summit were bad events. In fact, far from it. They did a lot of things that were right, but it still left a sour taste in my mouth because the low context goals of the event did not match the high context intent to create content. Because they were not aligned, because they were not simpatico, I felt a specific sense of loss. No matter what I did, I was either going to suffer a lack of context and therefore FOMO, or I was going to experience a very boring experience without really any sense of belonging. I truly believe that the answer to these problems is associative online virtual events. And I think that some people who are doing this really well include Threado, who has this amazing collaborative and deliberative infrastructure for building online webinars, where the speaker is actually in dialogue and conversation with other experts in the space who choose to contribute their own information via a Miro board or via a birds of a feather conversation, where the expert is only expected to talk for maybe 5 to 10 minutes of an hour-long meeting, and then that 5 to 10 minutes kickstarts an entire conversation. Another person that I think is doing this really, really well in the space is Rosie Sherry at Rosieland. A vast majority of the content that Rosie produces isn't necessarily produced on her own. A large majority of those discussions that Rosie is having end up in blogs and in a newsletter, but all of that conversation is basically just saying, here's the high context piece of content that gets you involved in the comment. I think one of the downsides to this approach, however, is that it doesn't necessarily get to ground, which is why I focus so much on this YouTube channel. So with that, we need to do 3 things in order to make our online communities better. First, we need to make sure that the low context gatherings and the high context artifacts or results of those gatherings, the content, are actually simpatico. Our goals are aligned. Further, we need to recognize that our community members are coming in with goals, values, and expertise themselves, and we need to leverage that to create an associative gathering. Even though we do have a central speaker, we need to be making sure that that speaker is having the discussion with other people in the chat, not the other way round. It's not enough for us to say AMA or Q&A anymore. We need to have the speaker take less of a stage, and we need to allow the speaker to bounce off of and iteratively produce valuable content with other experts who choose to attend. And lastly, the third thing that I think we need to do is we need to build synchronous gatherings over time and ritualistically with the intention of asynchronous consumption. That means we need to put just as much time and effort into posting and editing and building out content that occur as a result of that gathering as we do actually building the gathering. I feel like far too often, a large majority of community managers and event managers are simply too busy to follow up at the end of it in order to split that content and make it something worth consuming after the fact. And now we need to talk about implementation. How exactly are we going to do these things? I strongly advise that you view this video from Carolyn Zick, the next video on our playlist, all about coming to ground about the future of online events. And if you want to see the full playlist about the events in online community, there are a ton of amazing influencers in this space where we have community coach Carmen, Jen Junod, Niyama Ashang, and we're going to be finishing it off with, hey, we're actually doing it, a completely live, ever-present panel that's going to be happening on the 18th. I'm so hyped and excited for this. If you're interested in hearing more about what we can do in the Web3 space, I recommend taking a look at Carmen's video. If you're interested in the actual particulars, I recommend looking at Carolyn Zick's video on actually producing a really good online event. I also recommend looking at Jen Junod's video, which is whether or not we even need physical events to come online or hybrid events. And there are also some other great videos and resources for you to build awesome community events moving forward. Thank you so much, and definitely give the playlist a look.